Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the July to November CICE Call for Innovation. My name is Sarah Goodman, and I'm the new CEO here at the BC Centre for Innovation and Clean Energy. And I'm joined by my colleague, Omar Mauji, and together we'll walk you through this fantastic opportunity that we're very excited about, which is the $10 million, up to $10 million innovation call. And looking forward to hearing all your great ideas. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Please know that the session is being recorded, and that means it will also be available for you to go back and review online, as well as the PowerPoint presentation that we'll go through today will also be available online as well. As always, we like to start with a territorial land acknowledgement, and we're joining you here from the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam. And I suspect many of you are joining us from traditional territories across BC and perhaps beyond, and this map gives you a sense of that. And more importantly, I think one of the things that we really like to talk about here is just how many strong proponents we're seeing from Indigenous communities, and to date, 18% of our projects actually have very strong Indigenous participation. So that's fantastic to see. In terms of the agenda for today, we'll just walk you through that. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about who we are. Then I'll turn it over to Omar, who will walk you through the call for innovation that does run through July with investments made by November. Omar will also walk through the process and parameters, and we'll spend almost half the session really getting into your Q&As. And on the Q&As, encourage you all to use the Q&A function on the Zoom rather than the comments function. That will just help us make sure we capture your questions and answer them as we go. So in terms of who we are, CICE is an independent not-for-profit. We have our own independent board. We were founded in the fall of 2021, and thanks to the generous support of the BC government, Shell, and NRCan, we are now the province's largest early-stage investor in climate tech. And we're really excited every day to work with collaborators to help them commercialize and scale their world-class solutions from BC to the world. In terms of what we've done to date, and we'll have some news on our latest investments before too long here, but as of the end of March, we've invested $24.4 million into 36 different projects across the province, and that's unlocked a total project value of 145 million and 1 megatons of emissions. And that's really important to us because obviously we are here to reduce emissions as well as create jobs and economic opportunity across the province. You'll see at the bottom here, we have 4 different focus areas: battery, energy storage, carbon management, which is not the focus of the call, as Omar will talk about. We've got a wildfire call right now underway, and that's the focus there: low carbon biofuels and synthetic fuels, and low carbon hydrogen. So the 3 that we'll be focused on today are all those except for carbon management. And I'll turn it over to Omar, who will talk us through some of the exciting companies that are already in our portfolio.
All right, so I'm just going to go through our community of companies and funding partners that belong to BCCICE. In terms of our process, we try to be the fastest funders in the ecosystem right now. It takes us around 147 days from engagement at the expression of interest process to getting to funding the 36 projects that we have funded to date. When you look at our total portfolio in terms of where we sit, 76% of the companies we fund are led by underrepresented groups in British Columbia. 76% of the companies that we fund also happen to be startups, and how we classify that as companies that have yet to raise a Series A round. And of those startups, around $41 million of capital has been raised, either in public or private funding, since CICE made their first investment in those companies. In total, the projects that we've funded have added 574 jobs in BC, or have the potential to add that many jobs as they complete. 26 IP applications have come from the companies that we have funded, along with 6 IP applications being granted. And we expect this list to grow, again, as Sarah mentioned, as we complete our intake from back in January 2024. So we're very excited about that. Before we dive into the rest of this presentation, I'd just like to put a question out there and see where everyone is participating from. So you can use the chat function to just put out anything around where you're from so we can get an idea of where everyone is geographically. Oh, nice. Okay, well, we seem to get a lot of answers here, and that's great. And with a strong focus on projects outside of Metro Vancouver, out of the Metro Vancouver area, we're happy to see geographic diversity on display here. After all, this is a transition to net zero from all of BC, and so we're really excited to see some of the comments there around where everyone's from. So I'll walk further into the call for innovation that will span from July 2024 to November 2024. CICE has a three-pronged mandate. Our first kind of requirement for companies that are applying to CICE is that we're funding companies with a BC presence. And so CICE can only fund BC incorporated entities. So it's strongly encouraged that BC companies or those with BC partnerships apply through that BC incorporated entity so that we can release the funding to those entities as they get to our final stage. We are looking at companies from TRL 4 to 9. The way I describe that is we are looking at validating technology outside of the lab in an environment. So anything from that point to commercialization at TRL 9 is what we're looking to fund in this call. Finally, we're looking at the ability for companies to scale. It's very important because the premise of achieving our GHG emissions targets are that these companies will be able to realize what they've claimed to us in their application. And the way CICE funds impact is by evaluating companies' ability and understanding of getting their product to market and scaling operationally, financially, and legally with the right IP strategy. In terms of what CICE prioritizes, we go through quite a long process to determine what that will be for our calls, both directed and these intakes that we have. So CICE prioritizes areas within each of our four focus areas based on the intelligence we develop ultimately. And we've launched 2 reports over 2024, one in hydrogen and one in battery and energy storage in April and May of 2024. Our intelligence, along with ongoing stakeholder relationships and industry engagement, has led us to scope what will be the priorities for this intake for July to November 2024. And with that, we are going to be contributing up to $10 million for this call. In terms of our strategic priorities, as Sarah had mentioned previously, our carbon management portfolio will not be part of this intake. That will be covered by the wildfire tech call. The wildfire tech call will conclude in August 2024 and will have a separate allocation of up to $3 million for the call. Information can be found on the CICE website under funding and funding opportunities. You'll see both the wildfire tech call and this innovation intake. The July 2024 call for innovation will focus on the remaining 3 focus areas of low carbon hydrogen, low carbon bio and synthetic fuels, and battery and energy storage. Low carbon bio and synthetic fuels will be one of the first focuses that we have, and it's really around diversifying and aggregating feedstocks. So identifying key sources of feedstocks in BC and that can be used for low carbon renewable natural gas, biofuel, syngas, and synthetic fuel. We'll then be looking at integrating the value chain So integrating low carbon fuel value chain from feedstocks to end use for the purpose of commercialization. Then moving on to the low carbon hydrogen portfolio and what we're looking at, we'll have a main focus on solid carbon utilization. And this comes from our methane pyrolysis report. So identifying end use for solid carbon byproduct, identifying technologies that measure carbon intensity, including measuring, monitoring, and verification technology, and upgrading technology of solid carbon. The second part of this will be looking at hydrogen as a fuel. So the decarbonization of fossil fuels use in high emitting industries in British Columbia. We'll be looking at first of its kind implementation with a focus on low carbon hydrogen production. And then finally, in the battery and energy storage focus area, we will be looking at performance and sustainability. So really reducing costs by eliminating processes, materials, and energy usage, as well as reuse, recycling, and upcycling of batteries, and operational safety of battery and energy storage systems. Finally, we'll also, similarly to low carbon hydrogen, be looking at the use cases for energy storage. So decarbonization use cases in industrial, medium and heavy duty transportation, and utility grid support. So those will be our main focuses. You can also refer to the website as mentioned. So going to funding and funding opportunities, we will have a detailed application guideline that will highlight the specific focuses in each of the focus areas that we're looking at. So in terms of where we're going to go through next, we're looking at the questions that have come through on the call historically. And so we're going to answer some of those questions for you right off the bat. The first question that always comes up is, what is the maximum amount of funding per project? We don't have any hard requirements for a maximum or a minimum amount of funding. What we can give you is averages. So of the 36 projects that we have funded, our average check size has been $700,000. We intend to fund many companies in this call. So while the call is up to 10 million, it's understood that in our last call, we had around 9 companies that we funded. In the upcoming call, it'll likely be a similar outcome. And in this call, that outcome will likely be the same. So keep that in mind when looking for what to apply with and how much to request from CICE. In terms of our project length, the average project length of the companies we fund are relatively between 15 and 18 months, but we have a limit of up to 2 years. So that is a hard requirement there. And then another hard requirement on timing is the project must start within 6 months of signing a contribution agreement. For reference, in this call, we will be signing contribution agreements in November of 2024. So keeping in mind that those projects will have to start 6 months from that November 2024 timeline. Another question that often comes in is, when can funding be used? Once the funding agreement is signed in November 2024, that is when distributions will occur. We distribute our capital based on reimbursement expenses. So what will happen is, through these milestones, companies will provide us with their expenses as they've been incurred, and then we'll reimburse those amounts from what they've requested. It is important to note that no funding before the signing on November 2024 is an eligible expense by CICE to cover in our funding agreement. So you have to make sure that these expenses are after November 2024, and we'll ensure that the funding that is dispersed will align with the company itself. There'll be a period in stage 3 where we look at the project funding agreements, where the company and CICE will negotiate on the timeline as to when funding will be dispersed and reimbursed based on the stipulated timeline. Speaking of timelines, so here are the processes and key dates that will need to be attended to by both ourselves and the proponents that will be applying through this process. So important dates for companies that are applying for this call is, we will have the expression of interest intake open from today until August 1st. After that period, we will go through due diligence of the expression of interests. It's important to note for the applicants that the time commitment for the expression of interest should be no more than 1 or 2 hours. It includes a form and a video submission. Videos will not be judged on aesthetic quality, more on content and information. And we're asking in the videos not to waste too much time on helping us understand what the climate crisis is. We are very much aware of the climate crisis. What we want to understand is how is your solution going to help solve the climate crisis. So that's really important to note in the videos. Applicants will know of their stage 2 outcome by August 28th, 2024, at which point those that have moved to stage 2 will fill out a detailed proposal. That will be a 25-page detailed proposal from August 29th to September 18th, 2024. And then we will start a process of due diligence. We ask that all applicants be available during that due diligence period because we will have engagement between ourselves and the applicant consistently to help shape the investment memorandum for the investment committee. Applicants will be made aware of their status moving to stage 3 by November 7th, to which point the project funding agreement will need to be defined. And that's the process through the rest of November, where the applicant and the representative from CICE will negotiate terms of that project funding agreement. In terms of other questions around how can the funding be used, we specify that project costs are the only eligible costs for funding from CICE. So ensure that when you look at salaries, when you look at consultant costs, that the share associated with the project is the share that's put in the budget when applying for CICE funding. We will not fund anything outside of only project costs. So ensure that that is dealt with. In terms of what's outside of the funding scope is day-to-day business operations. So we will not fund anything that involves just general corporate expenses, highlighting kind of issues that have come about in some of the applications that we've looked at is a specific focus on simply R&D funding. We cannot fund only R&D funding. R&D funding has to be part of essentially moving that project to a later TRL where it's outside of the lab and validated in an environment. Additionally, we don't fund advertising or promotion, human resources, general furniture and equipment for the purpose outside of the project, and unrelated purchases to the project themselves. In terms of the questions around funding and co-funding, what are the rules on stacking limits and leveraging funds from other programs? So CICE, we are a flexible funder. We have no stacking limits. What we basically will communicate to the applicant or to the proponent is that they make aware the other funding opportunities that they're pursuing to ensure that those funding entities do not see us as some type of stacking funding that limits the ability for them to fund your projects. So that's one thing. The second thing is we do require some type of skin in the game from other companies as well as other funders. So generally, when we're looking at a project, we on average are funding about 50% of the company's total project costs. And so that's just a reference for you to use. That's not a solid focus. We sometimes will fund more than 50% and sometimes less than 50%, obviously depending on the project. And then another question around applications is, can organizations have more than one application or project funded with CICE? Yes. So we base our funding off the merits of decarbonization, not on how many projects we fund by one company. If there's a ton of innovation coming from that one company, we will fund multiple projects from that one company. So you're welcome to apply multiple times. In this application, we ask obviously that you not, 1 or 2, maybe 3 applications for the same company would be fine. But beyond that, it's important for companies to prioritize really what they want funding from CICE. We can't really go through more than 3 applications from the same company with the resources that we have. And then finally, what is the structure of collaborative projects? So we will accept projects led by a single organization. Going back to the BC presence, there are instances where we have technologies that are outside of British Columbia, but the applicant that's organizing basically the demonstration project will be in British Columbia. So we seek that entity in British Columbia be the lead applicant when it comes to applying for CICE funding. And then before we kind of conclude the information around the call, I'd just like to ask everyone in a poll how likely you would be to apply for this intake in July to November. I'll give some time for people to kind of fill that out, and we'll take a look at the results. Oh, all right. So it looks like a pretty big chunk of you are looking to apply for this intake. It's great to see. If anyone has any questions around eligibility, again, I would refer you to the website. So looking at funding and funding opportunities, you will then see our intake for 2024. And there will be a detailed application guide there for you to review along with our focus areas. So you'll be able to see whether or not you fit within those focus areas. And then, again, reach out to CICE at any time. You can review any of the application details, but we'd be happy to kind of have a further conversation to help understand whether you are eligible for this intake or not. So I guess that concludes the presentation. We're going to be moving on to Q&A, so I'll just leave that off there.
Great. Thanks, Omar. There's been a number of questions that have come in. I love it. We will try to get to as many as possible, but if we do not answer your question, please, please, please feel free to reach out to us directly, and we will try our best to get you the answers you need to move forward. The first one here, as a BC incorporated company, can we qualify for this call for innovation if our project is planned to be conducted in Alberta?
Absolutely. So we look at BC presence, and so as long as you're a BC incorporated company that meets the criteria for CICE, you can have a project anywhere in the world. There's no restrictions on that end.
Okay, another one. Can you provide examples of types of areas that are applicable to decarbonizing industry with hydrogen?
So when we look at opportunities in decarbonization, there's a heavy focus on mining and cement industries in British Columbia. So any use of hydrogen to replace diesel fuel or natural gas would be an opportunity there, even in the form of blending as well. So those are things that we look at in the hydrogen application space.
Great. Thanks, Omar. Does TRL9 qualify as a starting point?
Yes. So TRL9 will qualify as a starting point because we focus on innovation and technology. There just has to be a component of innovation within the project. And so usually at the TRL9, we're seeing like a first of its kind implementation and commercialization.
Great. Are university research groups eligible for CICE funding? Additionally, are collaborations with industrial partners supported under this program?
So in the first part, if the project is a lab-based project, it's ineligible for CICE funding. When it comes to engagement with industry, if there's a pathway to get from that lab testing and research into a validation with that industry partner, then that's something that we would consider. So it's really just extending that time.
Great. There's been a couple of questions around the next intake. If folks are not ready for this one, when is the next one? Do we have a timeline?
Yeah, so we have consistent intakes every year. We'll have them twice every year. So we had one in January 2024, and this one is in July 2024. So you can deduce that in the next year we'll also have similar timelines. So January 2025 and then July 2025.
Okay. Are you interested in EV battery reuse, repurpose, recycling?
Yes, so I highlighted that was a focus within our battery and energy storage focus area. Yeah, battery reuse, recycling, and upcycling is the focus there.
Okay. Does the diversification of feedstocks include municipal waste sludges?
Yes, any additional feedstocks that can be used for energy or for fuel is what we're looking for.
Alrighty. Will you consider projects that are currently in the front-end engineering design phase?
So when it comes to our funding, again, similar to the question around research, if it is just for the purpose of a feed study, we can't fund that project. But if the feed study is part of a grander project where there is validation and implementation, that is something we'll consider.
Alrighty. For the low carbon hydrogen area priority, are methods of producing hydrogen other than methane pyrolysis eligible?
Yeah, and so the main focus there is the energy usage, bringing the costs down of that production. That's what we're looking for when it comes to production. So any technology that makes that process more efficient is something we'd consider.
Okay. What does non-dilutive funding mean? I think that's an important one if we have people that are unclear on that terminology.
So non-dilutive funding is basically we're providing the company an amount of funding that doesn't need to be repaid and that doesn't involve any dilution on the cap table for the company.
Alrighty. What happens if the project gets delayed or lengthened and ends up lasting more than 2 years?
So there will be review processes through our milestone phase as the company signs the project funding agreement. There are, with many startups, expected delays, and we'll work with the company to identify whether those delays are going to be long-standing or not. And then depending on that, we'll either assess it internally or we'll bring it back to our investment committee for review.
Thanks, Omar. Are corporations that are incorporated in Ontario, while the founders are based out of BC, eligible for CICE grants?
No. So if you are an entity outside of British Columbia, we are unable to physically provide you funding. You have to be incorporated in British Columbia. And then we also would look for some type of presence. So in this instance, I would recommend that you look at a partner in British Columbia who could perhaps be the lead applicant of that process.
Great. Is using ESS for decarbonization of single-family dwellings within scope?
So that is outside of the implementation part of what we're looking at when it comes to battery and energy storage. However, I would recommend you taking a look at the application guide to further dive into what is applicable in our priorities, and also reach out to CICE. So we'll have our info at cice.ca email, and you can reach out at any time.
Would you consider a company that has a TRL of 3 that are looking for similar funding?
So TRL 3 is outside of scope for CICE funding. If you're on that cusp of TRL 3 to 4, maybe if components of your project are more mature, I would really kind of look into that to more accurately define your TRL level. But if you are TRL 3, you're out of scope for CICE funding.
Will this program be open to companies in Manitoba?
No, this company will not be eligible for companies outside of BC.
Great. What are the main differences in the types of projects you are looking for in the present call versus the innovation call from earlier this year?
So the innovation call from earlier this year was a little more broad. Since then, we've been able to really dig into, or well, actually through that process, we've been able to dig into, our themes for our focus areas. And really this call is going to be specifically prioritizing those themes that we've discovered. And when we look at it, the theme within carbon management is going to be wildfire technology. The theme within low carbon hydrogen will be solid carbon and hydrogen as a fuel or feedstock. And then battery and energy storage will be performance and sustainability and use cases for energy storage. And then finally, low carbon and bio and synthetic fuels will be diversifying and aggregating feedstocks and integrating a value chain.
As a California-based startup, would we be eligible for this fund if we partner with a company in BC? And where would we have to do the field implementation?
So if it is the partner in British Columbia, that is what we're looking for. So if you're outside of BC, partner with someone in BC. In terms of implementation, there has to be some benefit to BC, so it should be replicable in BC, but it doesn't have to be in British Columbia.
Great. Could hiring grants like MyTax count towards matching funding?
Yes, hiring grants from MyTax is considered as matching funding.
Could you please describe on the importance of IP generation in the project for the program?
Yeah, so our measurements at CICE is around technology and innovation, and the measurement for that is IP generation. So we look at what unique IP can be developed from the project implementation or the validation of that technology. So we do have a strong focus, and we can also connect companies who are trying to discover their IP strategy with the appropriate parties within the ecosystem in British Columbia.
What has been the highest funding contribution percentage to date?
We don't have a highest percentage amount, or I don't know if we have that information available right now, but I can tell you the highest amount or the range in which we funded. We funded as low as $150,000 per project and as high as $1.9 million per project.
Great. Could you clarify the bullet point of not funding strictly R&D activities, please? There are a few questions about R&D activities. Maybe we just need to clarify a little bit further, Omar.
Yeah, so in terms of ineligibility, if you're applying solely to fulfill a project that has R&D associated with it, we won't fund that project. But if your project has a component of R&D and will move outside of the lab and into an environment where you're validating with a partner or a potential customer, that's where we will consider your project. So if it's solely R&D, it's out of scope. But if R&D is a component of the project and it's going to go further into validation, we will consider that.
Will CICE do follow-on financing in future funding rounds for the same projects?
We will not do follow-on rounds for the same project. However, we will do follow-on rounds for a company. So there will be instances where they now have moved from validation into more of commercialization phase, and that's where we provide that follow-on funding.
Great. Does partnering with an organization that was previously funded by CICE impact the application in any way?
Absolutely not. So we are looking for innovation and technology. As long as it meets that criteria, that's what we consider for funding for CICE.
Excellent. As a young BC incorporated company, less than 1 year old, will this be seen as a negative in terms of BC presence if applying as the lead company?
Absolutely not. So when we go through the detailed due diligence phase, we will get an understanding of the intentions behind the company's incorporation in British Columbia. If the purpose of incorporation is solely to qualify for CICE funding, you will not be selected. But if we can see an effort in building out operations or presence in British Columbia, that's what we're mainly looking for.
Great. Now, there's been a few questions just about, which projects would be supported, et cetera. Here's one. Would projects be supported for the demonstration of hydrogen blending TRL 8 to 9 in the province of BC?
Yeah, so we will consider hydrogen blending in British Columbia. Again, if it meets that TRL level of 8 to 9, that will be considered by CICE.
Okay, and what about synthetic fuel produced from industrial CO2 qualify?
Yes, so again, that falls under kind of feedstock to a certain extent, but we do have a focus on synthetic fuels, and so it would fall within the scope of CICE funding for this team.
Alrighty. Can other fuel sources be considered in the biofuel focus group?
Yes, I've mentioned a few fuel sources, but all fuel sources are eligible for funding.
Great. Any interest in textile or garment recycling?
No, so that falls out of scope from our focus areas. Again, I would just refer you back to the application guideline, and you'll be able to see what our specific focus is. So recycling and closed loop systems and stuff like that will sometimes fall out of scope.
Alrighty. Do you support gasification technologies that eliminate landfills and MSW, GHG emissions and create waste to energy?
Yes, we do support that.
Excellent. What about dealing with thermal storage? Would this qualify?
So again, referring to the battery and energy storage focus within the application guide, that may be considered, but again, depending on the details of your project, I would recommend that you reach out to CICE to get an idea from our lead in the battery and energy storage space around that.
Okay. Will federally incorporated companies based in BC qualify?
Yes, so federally incorporated BC companies will qualify. I believe there is some type of equivalent incorporation in British Columbia. So as long as you approve that and you show that you have a presence in BC in some way, we'd be happy to fund that.
Alrighty. Another question here that's related to this, along the same lines, are entities with a subsidiary in BC but parent company internationally be eligible?
Yes, so during the due diligence process, we'll try and understand, again, the purpose of that subsidiary and the independence of that subsidiary. So that's the main focus that we'll have there, but you are eligible as long as you're BC incorporated.
Alrighty. Can you please clarify, will project locations outside BC be considered for funding?
Yes, there are no restrictions on where the project can be implemented.
Great. Does CICE expect any intellectual property rights to technology developed with funding from the program?
No, we do not.
Are projects that were previously unsuccessful in accessing CICE funding eligible?
Yes, I think there is a process where we have some feedback. So if there has been changes to the project or improvements in the project, I would recommend communicating that or even reaching out again to CICE to ensure that the feedback and the implementation has been made before the application is submitted.
Thanks, Omar. Is funding available for operating pilot project technologies?
Yeah, that falls in within TRL 4 to 9. So if there's a pilot project, we're happy to take a look at it.
Alrighty. Does having previous publications help improve our chances of acquiring funding?
No, not necessarily. I mean, it's great for when we get to the due diligence process, but that doesn't improve or reduce the chances of getting funding from CICE.
Okay, can First Nation investors based in BC be considered if they are partnered with them, though we are based and incorporated in Alberta?
So again, it would have to be a BC entity that's applying for funding. So I would recommend you reach out to CICE just to get a better understanding of what that structure looks like, and then we can kind of take it from there.
Okay, if we are a solo company in BC, but we don't have any operational historically in BC, can we be eligible?
Based on that description, and I may be making assumptions here, but it may be a little too early stage for CICE. What I would recommend is that you reach out to us and maybe we can get a better understanding of where you are on the project side and the TRL side.
This one's an interesting one. Can companies that support CICE be the main partner on the project?
So in terms of supporting within our ecosystem, I don't think there are any restrictions there. Obviously, there will be questions and questions asked within our due diligence to understand the relationship between that entity and CICE, as well as the technology and innovation proposed. But I don't see that as being a major hurdle. We would just have to conduct the appropriate due diligence on that.
Okay, if a design fits into 3 focus groups, does it require 3 applications or can 1 application be accepted?
So you'd have to prioritize what focus area that is primarily looking at. I think that also strengthens your application if you have a strong understanding in terms of what the majority impact is within our focus areas. But again, I would recommend you reach out to CICE to get a better understanding, and our team internally can kind of help guide you to which focus area to apply under.
Alrighty. Do you support manufacturing plans for another, I think it's cathode EV battery?
So if it is a large manufacturing plant that may go beyond TRL 9, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe at TRL 9. So again, it would have to be a conversation to understand what the innovation is in that project, and where it is at a TRL level.
All right. Another question, I think we answered this already, but since it's popping up again, does CICE take a percentage of IP?
No, we do not take anything associated with IP. We just want to know what IP is being developed for the purpose of our reporting. We have no involvement with the IP being generated from any company within our portfolio.
Great. Are projects or technologies that are currently in development eligible?
Yeah. So I mean, if from what I understand, those probably fall within kind of the TRL 6 to 8, maybe. So if it falls within that TRL level, they're applicable.
Alrighty. Are projects technologies with non-BC IP eligible?
So projects with non-BC IP are eligible, but there has to be, again, when we look at something like that, the applicant still has to be from BC, and there has to be some unique innovation or technology being developed from that project. So it can be a technology outside of British Columbia that's being implemented with a BC company in a first of its kind. So that would be a good example of how that works.
Great. Would projects that improve the safety and efficiency of firefighting efforts be considered?
So I believe that may be more aligned with the wildfire tech call, and I would refer you again, go to funding opportunities, and then the first funding opportunity is the wildfire call. So I'd take a look at that, and it should be highlighted in the guideline what is eligible for funding in the wildfire call.
Okay. Do the projects need to match funding?
The projects aren't required to match funding, but successful projects that have been funded by CICE have some sort of matching funding. So it's either another government source of funding or private sector funding or kind of corporate funding from their balance sheet.
Alrighty. Can funding from previous projects be considered as in-kind contributions towards a project?
No, we'll only look at funding related to the project. So if it is outside of the project, or if it covers multiple stages of different projects, you'll have to separate the amount that's attributed to that one project that we're funding.
Alrighty. Are expansions of existing generation with storage allowed?
Again, in terms of, I mean, there's not much detail there, but I would again recommend you to reach out to CICE to describe the project in more detail, and then our team at CICE can help guide you to the right outcome.
Alrighty. Is there a project matching collaboration process to lump multiple companies into a similarly structured project?
So CICE doesn't take on that responsibility. We leave it to the applicant to determine how to shape their collaboration. Again, we don't want to force companies to get into collaborative relationships or start a project that they're not ready for. So it's really up to the applicant.
Alrighty. Can land from an Indigenous band be considered matching funding?
Yeah, so it can be in-kind contribution, which would be considered matching funding.
Alrighty. There's a couple of questions here about the percentage of the project that CICE funds. Do you want to clarify, Omar?
Yeah, so I can clarify that. Well, again, we give out an average number. So the recommendation is that CICE is funding 50% of the project. But again, this depends on the type of project. So we're not saying that if it's above 50%, we wouldn't fund, or if it's below 50%, we wouldn't fund. We would just have to consider all aspects of the project before we make a decision on funding. But the average funding that we target is 50% coming from CICE, and then 50% coming from any other outside parties.
Great. If you currently have a project being funded by CICE, can you still apply for this round?
If it is related to a follow-on opportunity, you are not eligible. If it is a brand new project with a new innovation, so in many cases, companies have multiple different technologies that they're pursuing, that could be eligible. But I would again recommend that you reach out to CICE to really explain what that project is, and then we can see if it's eligible for funding.
Okay. Are projects of a subsidiary outside of BC whose parent company is incorporated in BC eligible?
No, yeah, so you have to be a BC incorporated entity. Like the physical transaction of us providing funding to companies cannot occur if the company is not BC incorporated.
Okay. If we have the plan to convert carbon, oops, I think my question just jumped around. We'll go to the next one. Would battery topics be considered in the following calls next year?
Yeah, so we will look at all these topics. They will carry forward into future calls, but we will have different priorities. So right now, those that are highlighted in this call are our main priorities for this call.
Okay. Would developing a new battery cell chemistry that reduces carbon footprints and improves safety quality be eligible for this call?
Yeah, from what you're explaining briefly, yes, it will likely be eligible. If you have concerns or questions around that, again, I reiterate reaching out to CICE.
Okay. All right. I run an electric vehicle company, one of the first in Canada, here in BC. How can you help?
Again, I would refer you to reach out to CICE. Maybe there's an opportunity there where we can discuss a potential project.
Okay, so I think our questions are starting to slow down a little bit here. As I said, if we did not get to your question and you would still like to follow up with us, I think on the next slide here, Omar, you have an actual email address, the info@cice.ca will work. Yeah, and with that, I'll let you wrap it up. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, so I appreciate everyone for coming onto the call. Great to see the number of people.
Great to see the number of people on this call and excited to see the outcomes. Again, we will be announcing some of the applicant winners from our previous intake soon, so be sure to take a look at that. And perhaps there is some commonality between what you plan to apply for in this intake and what we've kind of accepted in previous intakes. So very excited to see the applications come in, and just remember that this application process concludes August 1st, 2024. So be sure to get all your expression of interest in by then. And if you have any questions, again, reach out to info@cice.ca. We're going to be really engaged within the team to see those projects move forward to the application stage. All right, thank you. Take care.